Hello, hello, and welcome to all of you beautiful souls tuning in today to the Heart of the Soul podcast. I'm your host, Amana, and I am so happy that you're here. On the Heart of the Soul, we remember
Thank you
what
for
it, oh, sorry. Yeah. On the Heart of the Soul, we remember what it means to be wild women walking upon this earth. We share our stories and honor how they inevitably shift and change over time, and depending on who we're talking to. This is a space for story medicine, an opportunity to practice using our voices and the ancient ritual of storytelling. These stories are an opportunity to experience a deeper understanding of one another and together learn to support each other on our unique paths in this life so that we can all feel more connected and less alone. I hope that you receive wisdom as well as deep heart and soul connections as you soak in these stories. Today is September 11th, 2022. I'm on my in-laws' back porch right now here in Washington State, where we have smoke filling our skies from some wildfires happening in Idaho. Yesterday was a full moon, and I had an amazing gathering with women of my community as we honored the full moon, ate delicious food, and shared stories about change and how we and our lives are always constantly changing. I have Diana Forsell Tayan with me today. I have listened to every one of her episodes on her beautiful podcast called Healing Birth, where she holds such tender space for women to share their stories of birth and healing. And I am so excited to get connected with her here today. Thank you so much for being here, Diana. I would love for you to introduce yourself a bit, tell people where you are in the world, and anything else you feel called to share right now.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me, and what a beautiful intro. I'm very touched by your mission here.
Hmm.
So I am in Hawaii. I am on Kauai, which is the northernmost island. I'm actually originally from Washington State. I didn't know that that's where you were, so that's cool.
Yeah.
Um, and I guess you could say, in terms of a bio, my work surrounding supporting women who have experienced birth trauma really started with my own entry into motherhood, which was a very, very traumatic first birth that was followed by a really beautiful home birth experience. And after having the two, I felt like my life has to be dedicated to helping women in whatever way I can have, the healing and feel the wholeness and the experience of birth that doesn't happen in a traumatic way, which it does for so many of us, unfortunately. And so I've been podcasting for about 3 years, like you mentioned. My show is called Healing Birth, and I share stories of birth trauma and healing. It's really a place for people to hear stories like their own if they've had a traumatic birth. And we don't do that because we celebrate birth trauma, but we do it because it's important that we know that we're not alone in our stories. And a huge mission of the podcast is also to highlight stories of healing. And it's story medicine as well. I want people to know that even if you've had a very traumatic or a hard experience the first, the second, the third, the fourth time, you can always have a different experience with a different baby, or even experience healing outside of the realm of birth. There's so many different ways that we can heal from the somatic trauma, spiritual trauma, physical trauma of birth trauma. So that's really my mission in life. I do some other things where I sometimes work with women one-on-one, and sometimes I hold workshops. Sometimes I write things that have been published in places about this topic, but my heart really is sharing story medicine. It doing like what you're doing on the show. That's really what I'm doing on my show too. So thank you for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you.
Yes, beautiful, beautiful. Yes. Yeah, for motherhood for you, like, did you always know that you wanted to be a mother, or like where did that begin for you?
Oh, I always knew I wanted to be a mother. I love children. I've worked with children in varying capacities pretty much my whole life. And so I always knew I wanted to be a mother. I can't imagine life without my children. So when I found out I was pregnant, it was an unexpected pregnancy, but it was very much welcomed with joy.
Yes, yes. And did you know much about birth? You know, at that time, you knew you wanted to be a mom. Had you witnessed birth with other people in your life or community, or known where you wanted to give birth? Or, yeah.
Well, it's funny because on one hand, yes, I did. I knew enough to know that I did not want to be part of the obstetric model of care. And I knew that I didn't want to be in a hospital. And I knew actually a lot about what happens to women when they give birth in a hospital, which, by the way, I just want to say is fine if someone wants to give birth in a hospital. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that for me personally, I kind of looked at that model of care and went, I know I don't want it. So I knew that much, but the part that I didn't understand was midwifery. So I really thought that if I hire a midwife, I'll just have an easy home birth. And I really didn't understand that there's some complexity to that in terms of, midwives aren't always able to serve women in the ways that we think that they can. They don't always operate as independently as we tend to think of a, elder midwife would. And in some ways, they're encumbered by the same system and the same rules and the same testing procedures and the same licensing boards
Yeah.
as physicians that oftentimes practice really fear-based medicine in the childbirth space. And so I like knew enough to know I wanted to be at home, but I didn't understand, I would say, that part of the midwifery model of care and how to really vet for the right person to attend me at home. And I definitely learned that lesson the hard way, unfortunately.
Would you like to go into your birth story now and how that was for you and what you mean by saying that you learned the lesson in the hard way?
Yeah, I can share it. Um, there isn't really like a bad person in this story. I actually really don't blame my midwives. I just kind of see the way that they were operating was a little bit different from what I had hoped. So,
Yeah, no,
so I,
I'm glad you point that out because I think I myself also didn't understand that, yeah, licensed midwives were, their hands were tied in the same ways and had they were either have to like abandon their licensure or abandon the woman, in certain cases in birth. So thank you for bringing that.
yeah. Well, I think it's true for a lot of us, especially as first-time moms. And something that I hear a lot of first-time moms say is that they have a midwife in a hospital and they don't realize that midwives in the hospital, at least here in the United States, they're OB nurses. And I don't think if they realized what they actually were, I don't know how they're able to co-opt the term midwife, but that's what their actual training is.
Hmm.
And so it's just, the language is kind of bungled right now. And it's just so common for most of us not to really understand that part of maternity care.
Hmm.
So I can share his story. So I went into labor at 41 weeks and I was really excited. And I was planning a home birth with a midwife and a doula. And labor started sort of in the mid-afternoon and then sort of picked up a little bit and then died out, picked up a little bit and then died out, like very typical first time mom thing. And it's so weird to tell a birth story, as I'm sure you know, because time does like a weird bendy thing. And so it's really hard to like give you a timeline. But sometime into the night of that first day that labor began, I called over my midwife, I called over my doula, and I was in pretty active labor. Um, I labored all night long. Um, there's not much to say about the labor, although other than it was, labor, it was hard. It was the first time I had experienced it. I was sort of in and out of the water. My midwife and doula sort of took turns supporting me. And then at some time in the morning, after having labored for like an afternoon, an evening, all night long. So I don't know how many hours that would have been, like a little, I don't know. It was a while, but not crazy long.
Yeah.
And I think that at some point my dilation had been checked, and I think I was around like 8 or 9. So I was close. But at some time in the morning, my midwife, I kind of had the sense that everyone was really tired, which is understandable. And my midwife suggested that I was tired and that we transfer to the hospital.
Mm.
And there wasn't an emergency. His heart rate was fine. I could feel him. Like I knew he was fine. And I was definitely in it. I was in it. I was working hard, but I didn't feel like I couldn't do it. And I also, being a very first time mom, I didn't really know like what is normal. It would have been really helpful if there had just been someone there who's like, everything looks normal. I mean, maybe it didn't. I looking back and now having given birth a second time, I can't pinpoint anything that was wrong or scary about that first labor, but just her suggesting that we could transfer or we should transfer in my laboring brain meant, oh, we need to transfer. There's something wrong. There's something wrong with me. There's something wrong with the baby.
Mm.
And so we transferred. And I, from the moment I remember so distinctly from the moment I got, not even to the hospital, but like in the car, I was like no longer an active participant in this labor experience. I had already given over completely the process to whoever was now going to manage my labor. And it was a horrible feeling. And I also remember like the pain amped up to a 20 out of 10 at that point. And I think it was because I knew, I was not in control of the situation in any way. Not that you ever really are, but I really wasn't. And this really was not what I wanted. And so, what happened at the hospital was all the typical hospital things. They gave me an epidural. I don't think I asked for it. They just did it. And I was not really in a space where I could talk or advocate or say anything. They broke my water. Again, had no say in that. And I do want to say, like, my story, I truly believe that there isn't really a bad guy. I really think everyone at the hospital was just doing what they do. I don't really blame them either, to be honest. And so, I got the cascade of interventions. Eventually, I got Pitocin. And then as soon as the Pitocin was given to me, my baby's heart rate started um, doing funky things, which we know is a side effect of Pitocin. I know now. And then it was just an immediate C-section.
Mm.
And the C-section itself was very traumatic. It was, I can't, I mean, for anyone who hasn't been through it, and Amana, I don't know enough details about your story to know if you have or not. Maybe we can talk about that later, but I just can't even describe what it's like to be awake and have your baby cut out of you. Um, Even if you're not feeling all of the sensations of that, you are on a psychic and spiritual level feeling exactly what's going on. And it really created this like a rift in me that took a long time to repair. Um and so we had the C-section and he was fine. I was fine. I'm using air quotes. But I left that experience totally devastated because I mean, I knew what the cascade of intervention was. I knew I didn't want to give birth in a hospital. And I just thought, like, what's wrong with me that I couldn't do this? Like,
Mm.
am I broken? Does my body even work? How did that even happen to me? And he was a pretty big baby. He was 12 pounds, which was everybody's explanation for why the C-section needed to happen. But
Mm.
something I want to mention that I didn't realize until some other woman said it on a different podcast that I listened to is that when you're in the hospital and you're getting intravenous IV medications and saline and fluids, that can actually inflate the size of your baby. So he was going to be big no matter what, but I don't know if his weight was inflated because of that experience. I mean, there's just a lot of unknowns. And I've even entertained the possibility to make sure that I'm really being curious and intellectually honest with myself that maybe he actually did have to be born via C-section. Maybe he was too big. That doesn't feel right to me, but it could be. I'm kind of at this point, he's 9 now, so I've had a lot of time to process this birth, but I'm
Mhm.
kind of okay with the mystery of it, the kind of not knowing ever, did that have to
Right.
happen or not? And also, can I just accept it? So
Mm.
that was my first son's birth.
Yeah, the unknowing, like you said, you'll never know for sure whether you could have birthed him vaginally or not. It's yeah, so interesting to
Mm-hmm.
sit in those spaces.
Yeah.
Hmm. And yeah, telling your story, I mean, it made me think about a little bit about informed consent and how it almost feels like that's not possible in birth in a lot of ways, or it could be really hard when we're birthing and we're in that like cosmic birth realm, that to try and like think logically and have people, like you said, I mean, you sort of described it as people just doing things without even asking. But
Oh yeah.
even if they had been asking, I'm not sure it's fully possible to give the information and be able to like think about it critically in labor to make
I
the
mean,
decision.
I don't think it is,
Yeah.
especially after hearing, all of the birth stories that I've heard,
Mhm.
just doing my podcast, not just my own story. It doesn't feel like it's possible to give proper informed consent in that moment because you're not really thinking. By design, you're
Yes.
really not thinking. And also there's so much fear. I mean, anytime that someone wants to intervene into your birth process, there's usually a fear behind that desire to intervene. And as a mother, how are you supposed to react to, well, we need to do this in order to X, Y, and Z, save your baby, protect your baby, save you, protect you. I mean,
Mhm.
I don't even know how we're able to counteract that. Even if the language used isn't that strong, the implication is often there.
Right. It's like they're putting you in some sort of double bind where if you care about your baby, you must do what they say kind of situation, or that's how it feels.
Yeah.
Yeah. And when you described, that you were being, cut open and that your baby was being pulled out of you, that even though you couldn't like feel it, like your mind couldn't feel it in that time, that your body still was experiencing that and feeling those sensations, even if your mind wasn't. And it sounds like you have taken lots of time and done healing and somatic work on. Yeah, I'd love to hear more about what you were speaking to about your somatic healing and how that was, what his postpartum was like, and yeah.
His postpartum was so hard in every way. We had, I mean, every breastfeeding challenge you can have, literally every single one.
Mm,
He was, you know, I don't like to use the word colicky because I don't think that's a real thing, honestly, but he cried a lot. And I think that it had to do with how traumatic his birth was. I think his sweet little spirit felt it too.
mm-hmm,
I was, I was having PTSD flashbacks and so many tears. I don't know if I would call it depression exactly because it was definitely situational, but just it was very, very hard. And it thinking back on it, it makes me so sad because I only got one postpartum with that child, my precious 9-year-old boy. And it just makes me sad that so much of that time was spent struggling and not enjoying him and loving him. Of course, I loved him, but you know what I mean? Not just appreciating this new life in my life. Instead, it was really full of struggle,
mm-hmm,
which all, eventually got better with time, as these things typically do. But, in terms of healing, you asked about healing. None of that even started for me until like a year postpartum. That first whole year was really just uh, a one massive, huge adjustment with a really big emphasis on trying to get breastfeeding to work, which it eventually did, thank God. Um, and the healing for me, I want to be really careful about how I say this because I'm very sensitive to the fact that not everybody gets a redemptive birth, like a do-over where they get to complete the birth process vaginally and see that they can do it. So I want to preface this by saying that this can be done in many different ways. You can heal in lots of different ways. But if I'm being completely honest, it was my second pregnancy and my second birth that was the most healing for me. I mean, that experience totally took away my feelings of failure, self doubt. So much of the pain of that first birth experience was just eradicated by the second time. And I think that that was compounded by the fact that because I was a VBAC in Washington State at the time, I don't know if this is still the case, midwives were not allowed to attend me at home. So in order for me to find the courage to really say, no, I'm staying home and doing this, and I'm going to trust that it's going to work, I didn't really have like a cheerleader or like anyone, any real support. And so the fact that I still did it and it was such a good experience, just I drew so much power from that and so much strength from that. And that's really where the healing came for me. And I look at it now as truly a gift of grace. I think that my son, my second son, he's kind of like an angel in my life, honestly. And it wasn't something that I did or I succeeded. I really feel like I was given this big gift of healing and grace, and then maybe a slight push to go support other women. Now that you've experienced some healing in this area, share it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And how old was your son well, your first son when you conceived your second son?
He was 2,
Two.
just about 2. Yeah.
Yeah. And was that one conscious or was that another
Nope.
surprise?
No. No, I actually have no idea how I conceived. I had like literally just got my period back right when my second baby turned 2, because I don't know, when I breastfeed that long, that's just how my body works. And so I remember getting my period back right at his second birthday
Yeah.
and telling my partner, okay, we have to be careful because this happened and we could get pregnant again. And then I was immediately pregnant again. And I don't know how we let that happen. I really don't. I really think this kid just wanted to come through.
That's
Yeah.
I believe that, yeah, people come through. I mean, my mom was taking birth control and I, came on through anyway. It's
Wow.
yeah.
Yeah. I have a friend, not to get off track too much, but I have a friend, I swear this is a true story. His mom had a tubal ligation that worked. Okay, so like
Yes.
she had her tubes tied.
Yes.
She was in her 50s, early 50s, with a tubal ligation, and she conceived him.
Wow.
And he is the kind of person that just wanted to come through. I mean,
Yeah.
life really does make a way.
Yes. I truly believe that as well. So you're not expecting to be pregnant, and here you are, and you have, done some processing and healing of your first birth. And yeah, how did that feel to then be like, oh, this is, happening again?
Initially, it was really scary because I just thought I can't ever. I mean, my first thought was like, I can't ever go back to a hospital ever again.
Mm-hmm.
Again, not because they're evil or they're terrible, but because I knew I would just never feel safe there, ever. I would never feel safe.
Yeah.
And at the time, I didn't know what options were available. I didn't know that there were women who would, be with you in a non-medical capacity if you felt comfortable with that and wanted to give birth at home. I did happen to know that licensed midwives in my state couldn't attend me if I had had a previous surgical birth. And so I just thought, well, I don't know what I'm going to do. And I cried a lot at first and prayed a lot about it. And I feel, I feel like, I hate to even say this out loud, but for just a second, like a brief second, I let myself try on the idea of ending that pregnancy, which is hard to say out loud just because of knowing who he is now. Literally can't imagine my life without him. Um, but it was like as soon as I had that thought, it was an immediate heart no. It was like a no, you want this person really wants to come through. Um, and so I sat with a lot of discomfort for a while. Like I said, I prayed about it. And eventually I really feel like through grace, I was shown a way. I talked to a woman in my community who had shared with me her story that she had had a cesarean birth with her first baby. And then the second time she had birthed at home. And I asked her, how did you do that? Like who was with you? What did that look like? And she very generously and beautifully, I'll never forget her. I'm so grateful for her. Just
Mm-hmm.
shared what she did. And, I just want to say, like, this is why story medicine is so powerful, and podcasts like what you're doing and what I'm doing on my show is so powerful, because when we hear each other's stories, we can have that kind of an impact on someone else's life. And this woman just sharing, in my own home state, how she navigated that second birth helped me find a way to, um, stay home and have my baby, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And that birth experience was totally different, also challenging in its own way,
Mm-hmm.
but incredible. I mean, I can't even describe what it's like when you've had your baby cut out of your abdomen to then birth another baby and pull it up onto your chest and look into his eyes and feel him move and not have anyone touch that baby or touch you or interfere at all in the process. It's just, it changed my entire life. There's a photo of me in that exact moment, and I look like I am high on ecstasy times 10, like I've had 15 of the best orgasms of my entire life. I mean, I've never seen anyone glow like that. I mean, and that's what it felt like. And
Yes.
I'll never forget that moment. I'm so grateful for it.
Yes. Yeah. So what did that birth look like for you? Who did you have in your space and what did you choose for that labor and birth experience?
I found a someone who was trained as a midwife but was willing to like work outside of the system,
Mm-hmm.
sort of like not have me on the books, I guess.
Yeah.
Um,
Like radical birth
and
style or some people would call
yeah,
it that or I'm not sure, but
yep. Basically like that, yeah. And then I also hired a doula who she said that she specialized in VBAC births. And I think what that basically means is that she had had one. So she kind of knows like the psychology of those of us that, I think, women that are VBAC moms, I really think we just really need more psychological support. It's not even the physical stuff. It's that we have more to process emotionally and psychologically than maybe a different type of second time mom or a
mm-hmm.
different of someone who had had a different birth. So
Sure.
so I hired her. She was very sweet. And that birth happened crazy fast. I woke up and I'll back up and I'll say this. I've heard other people in the realm of birth say that when a birth is interrupted by a cesarean section and it doesn't get to complete the first time,
Mm-hmm.
that the second time that birth starts in the process where that first birth ended. Does that make sense? Do you see what I'm
Yeah, you
saying?
give me chills just saying that. Yeah. Yeah, it totally
That
makes sense.
that
Absolutely.
yes.
Yeah.
And I think that that's important to state because for me, I feel like that is the incredible wisdom of our bodies and our babies helping us complete the somatic cycle that
Yes.
was interrupted the first time. And so I started labor. It was exactly the intensity and the length of contractions as like the middle of my labor with my first baby. Like that's how labor started. It was almost as if the process had been started, 2 years ago with that first birth and it was
Mm.
ending the second time. So I woke up at like 3 a.m., just bam, in super hard labor, labored by myself for a while, called my birth keeper at 4 or 5 a.m., called my doula at the same time. They arrived at like 6 a.m. And my baby was born at 8:30 on my bed, sitting in an upright position. Like I said, I pulled him up. I mean, in some ways, it's a very simple story. It's an example of how like simple and straightforward birth can be.
Mm.
And it was fast. It was something like what, 6 hours, something like
Mm-hmm.
6 hours, really fast, and just totally completely different from my first one.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yes. Yes. Hmm. And for him, you also were able to birth his placenta. What was that like for you?
Yeah. I don't even remember birthing it. I just remember seeing it. I remember holding him and being so high, like high as a kite on that oxytocin rush, so high that I don't even remember birthing the placenta. But then at some point, someone said, "Hey, Diana, do you want to see your placenta?" And I really did because I didn't get to see it the first time. And it had really made me sad that I didn't get to see it the first time. So I got to see it again. Don't remember it coming out. It must have come out with him very, very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so even that was very unremarkable. It just happened. I don't really remember it, but it happened.
Yes, I love how like birth
And
is like so unique and then also like the same, similar series of events that happen. The baby is born.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it just he was born, and breastfeeding was like easy this time. I mean, it just no problem at all. Tons of supply, no latch issues. I mean, totally different experience. And I think that part of that is the fact that we had a physiological undisturbed birth, and part of it is also that I had worked so hard with my first baby to figure it out. So it was probably a combination of the two, but that was such a gift too. To have a smooth and easy breastfeeding experience just makes so much of postpartum so much easier.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. And you said it was the experience of that son's birth that sort of sparked your fire to then support other women within the birth realm.
Yeah. Yeah. At the time, I had been working a corporate job. I was working in the medical insurance field. It had been a career for like 10 years. And I think we touched earlier that we both have kind of a shared history in the medical realm, which might be fun to talk about a little bit later.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but I quit my corporate job. I started researching, what are different ways that I can support other women that have been through the experience that I have been through, because I just really I had a fire for it in my heart.
Mm-hmm.
And I looked into birth story medicine, which is this really quite beautiful method of sitting with women in the pain of a painful birth story. And these are my words, not the words of the facilitator, but kind of mining that experience for some gold, and also being an empathic listener, because sometimes when we have a story, a birth story that's difficult, it's so important to be heard. And there are very few places where we can actually share them and be heard.
Mm-hmm.
Most people don't want to hear about your C-section, but it's important to talk about it. And even if we, have a story that is painful or difficult or hard or scary, it's also still a birth. Even if it isn't a live birth, it's still a birth of a baby. And so, as mothers, I felt it was very important to be a space holder for other women's stories. And so I actually got some certification around that and offered that as a service for a while. And at a certain point, I realized that if I started a podcast, I could just reach way more people. I could be doing kind of the same work, but it would reach so much more people. And I also found that working one on one with women was challenging in a different way than interviewing people for a podcast. Because when you're brought in to a very deeply emotional story and they're looking to you specifically for support and feedback,
Mm-hmm.
not advice, but sometimes feedback, it required like a lot emotionally, that at the time I felt like I don't know how much of this I can do.
Mm-hmm.
So I transitioned to podcasting, and I've been doing that ever since. And I absolutely love it. I talk to women all over the world. I've learned so much. Every single story that I hear, I feel like I learned something different, not only about birth and women's lives, but also just life in general, how to be a better person, how to deal with challenges in my own life. So,
Yes, I
yeah.
feel like storytelling is it's such a natural way to learn, especially as humans. Like before we had written language, we, shared knowledge through stories and um like I definitely have learned so much through your podcast, through other podcasts. I in a way that I never learned, in a like structured slideshow, PDF. That just for me is not like a way that I can absorb in the I'm losing my words here, but it's so different to be listening to real life experiences from other women. And those have been such potent medicine for me. And so that's also why I started my podcast and share with women and have them come and share as well. So That makes sense.
Awesome. Well,
Yeah.
hey, does it make sense to transition a little bit and let me ask
Sure.
you about you? Awesome.
Yeah, let me just say that,
Okay.
yeah, we're trying something a little different today, and we're going to kind of go back and forth. And Diana and I are going to ask, each other things, and I'll share some of my stories, and as she shares hers as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So, Amana, I know a little bit about I'll say your birth journey, your journey with birth.
Hmm.
Just a little bit that you shared with me. Um, I want to ask you to, I guess, start with maybe your first pregnancy, but as I'm kind of feeling into my question, I really want to know about your baby that was born without two
Babies.
kidneys and
Hmm.
who was born at home full term. That's all that I know about this story, but that I really want to know about that story in particular. So I don't know if you want to share all five of your stories or if we could touch on them, but really tell me about that baby.
Yeah, yeah, I would love to share Hartley's story with you, and yeah, have you ask me more deeper questions about it. And I would love to just start with, I was like you, I always knew I wanted to be a mom, and I've, shared this on my podcast before, so some people will be hearing this again, and I think that's totally okay. Um, I babysat, I was a nanny, I attended births as a midwife assistant for years, and just always knew I wanted to be a mom. Yeah, and with that was birth center and home births with those midwives, and I just always knew I wanted to have a home birth and was so excited to enter motherhood. Most of my friends had already had babies, and I was in my early 30s and had kind of dreamt of being a mother in my 20s, and that just wasn't the reality for me, but that's okay. And my first pregnancy was a 6-week loss, 6-week early birth. And, that was hard for me in the moment. And then when I got pregnant again, I was really focused on speaking to this little wombling and asking them to stay. And my husband and I we're really calling in our spirit babies and this soul. And I was just, yeah, so excited to hold her in my womb. I didn't know she was a her then. I chose care with a single midwife practice because I had worked with midwifery practice with, 3 midwives before. And some people might know that with a practice like that, you don't know which midwife will be at your birth. And trying to find a practice where I liked all 3 midwives felt like a challenge, but I found this beautiful midwife who was a single practice midwife. And I had decided not to have an ultrasound in that pregnancy unless I had some sign from my baby that that was something that, well, in my mind, I said, if that's something that you need, not that it's ever really needed, but I was super nauseous, vomiting a ton in this pregnancy. It was super, super challenging. I tried so many different things. And then when I was, 6 months along, we had moved into a new home, and I, started getting the space ready and could feel my baby moving inside of me. And I started having some like right-sided back pain. And I thought maybe it was just like round ligament pain or something like that. These pains that I had heard were possible in pregnancy. And then I started having bloody urine. And so at that point, I decided to seek some medical advice or care. And they tested my blood and tested my urine, and they wound up asking to do like my white count was really high. So I had an infection, and they did an ultrasound of my kidneys, like, and the ureters. And it turned out that I had a blocked right ureter, which is the tube from your kidney down to your bladder. And I was admitted to the hospital and they gave me a couple of options. I won't go too into detail, but I wound up having a stent placed. And they were asking about ultrasound, and I sort of decided that I would have an ultrasound at that point. Like maybe this was my baby's sign. And so after I was discharged, I came back like the next day and had an ultrasound. And it was through that ultrasound that they then told us that the baby inside of me didn't have any kidneys. So it's called bilateral renal agenesis. And so there I was going into the hospital because I had a blocked, ureter from my kidney to my bladder, to find out that my baby didn't have kidneys at all. And that felt like a really big connection. Um,
Can I
yeah.
just say, as you were speaking, I was absolutely struck that the physical signs that you were having in your body was from kidney problems.
Mm-hmm.
And you had even said at the beginning that you weren't going to get an ultrasound unless your baby let you know.
Mm-hmm.
It's like your baby did.
Yeah, yeah. So then from that, without kidneys, they then can't make amniotic fluid and lungs don't develop. And so my baby, there was nothing that could be done. And I knew that this baby would die after being born or possibly in labor, because without the amniotic fluid, there's can be like cord compression and things like that. They offered that I could induce labor then, but for me, that was definitely not the choice I wanted to make. I, went through a big grieving in those couple of days and weeks, just like wailed primal screams that sounds like that have never come out of me again. I was so angry at, my body, at my husband, at the world, at universe. Like, you put this desire for me to have a baby, and now like this is my experience, and now this you're telling me that this baby's gonna die. Um, so that was really hard. But I made peace with it to the best that I, could. Some people have asked me, do you wish you wouldn't have known and you would have just given birth and then found out? Um, and for me, I feel like I'm so grateful that my baby helped me to find out, because if I hadn't known, and I would have birthed her at home the way I was planning, and then I would have been trying to resuscitate her, and like her moments of life would have been these like painful medical interventions and trying to get to the hospital, and so I'm really grateful that I knew ahead of time. I got to make, intentional memories with my family and, with my baby, and do pictures. And I was really blessed to have a beautiful community of women around me that held a blessing way ceremony, a different kind of blessing way, knowing that, this little soul and baby inside of me that they wouldn't meet on the outside. But still, I'm getting tearful thinking about it, just, still honoring me and this life. Um, so that was really, I'm really grateful, will forever be grateful for that experience. And I didn't want to go into labor because I knew that labor meant birth, which for my baby meant death. So I was just, I knew it would come, and yet I didn't want it to. And then one evening, actually at my in-laws' house where I'm at now, labor began. And so then we made the drive home, and I tried to slow down labor, and it was really, her labor was really gentle to be it. Now that I've experienced, two more full-term births and labors, her labor and birth was the most gentle of the three and had a really slow progression over a couple of days. I birthed her on Monday morning. So after a couple nights of laboring. And Yeah, I was at home. My husband was there with me, and I wound up in the birth pool. And from the ultrasound, we knew that she was bummed down, so it was going to be a breech birth at home. And
Wow.
I was in the birthing pool, and we weren't checking. I decided I didn't want to check heart tones or anything like that. I didn't want to know if she died during labor. And when I sort of started to feel that urge to push, I called out to my midwife to come and be with us. And it felt good to have her in the space because I know my husband was, this was his first big birth experience other than his own birth. Um, and her little bum came out, and then I birthed most of her body, and then she was just this part of her was still inside of me. And when it was like that, she was moving her, and I said to Owen, our baby's moving, like, and he got to feel her move. And then I gave another push and pulled her up out of the water, and she had her eyes closed and she never opened them. And she took a few breaths before her soul left her sweet little body.
Sorry, I'm just over here crying too.
It's okay. Sometimes I get emotional sharing it and sometimes I don't. It's just hard to, know when it's gonna happen. But
There's so many, there's so much grace in your story, even though it's so heartbreaking. The fact that you knew ahead of time and you got to plan for that, and
mhm.
the sweet, gentle labor that you got, and the fact that you got to have like a moment with her still present in her body with you and your partner just really moves me, and it really makes me wonder, and I'm sure you've thought a lot about this, who is the soul and what is your guys' connection? I mean, you guys must have some sort of a really deep karmic, deep soul connection that maybe one day in a different life will make sense,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know?
absolutely. Yes, I definitely, feel her here with me, and she's one of my guides in this life and in this realm, and I'm grateful that I got to be her mom.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, how was your postpartum during that experience? How did you, I don't know, continue on
Yeah, it
after
was
that?
it was the biggest dark night of the soul that I've ever experienced in my life. I was able to take 6 months off of work, which for me was really, um, I'm so grateful that I did that and we were able to make that work. I I just remember feeling so like empty after just not and being able to like fold in half and like that she was no longer there. And, I could feel her spirit at times. And yet, it's not the same as an embodied soul, like inside of a body. It's a different experience. My husband and I decided he had a couple of weeks off work, and we decided to go down like the Oregon coast and into the redwoods. So we took a little road trip, which felt better than being at home and being at kind of like the regular grocery stores with the people who saw me pregnant and then might ask, or, like, because those mundane little conversations just become a deep wound when the outcome is different than what other people are expecting. So we waited for her ashes to come, and we picked up her ashes. And I remember, like, in the beginning of the road trip, we brought not all of her ashes with us, but a lot of them, because I was afraid that, like, what if something happened and then like we didn't have any of that, like if they got stolen or a car accident or who knows what. So, but I remember this Nora Jones song came on, which, like, in the song she talks about a bag of bones, and it was just like we found humor within
Oh,
the sadness that we literally had our baby like a bag of bones in the car with us, and we took her everywhere. I took her into restaurants and, all the places. And I decided to pump my milk to donate. I didn't donate during the trip, but I knew that that's something I wanted to do. So I was pumping milk in the car as we drove along, and we chose a few places to release some of her ashes back to the ocean, where one drop becomes all drop, from dust to dust. And I released some of my milk in some of those places as well, which felt really honoring of her to leave some nourishment along with her body. And we we were a newer relationship as well. So it was a dynamic of, and everyone grieves differently. Grief is such a unique experience for all of us. And even though we were grieving the same loss, we grieved differently. So there was a lot of like space holding and like giving space as well for the different ways that we needed to grieve, as we also like fell more deeply connected in love with each other at the same time.
Wow. You mentioned those interactions at the grocery store where well-meaning strangers might have asked you, oh, you had your baby or something. It
Mm-hmm.
made me wonder if it made me wonder, could you speak to how those of us, if we have someone in our life who goes through a loss like
Mm-hmm.
you did, what's the best way to support a sister who's going through that or has just gone through that
Mm-hmm.
from your perspective?
Yeah, yeah. Obviously can't speak to everyone because everyone grieves differently. But, for me and I have spoken with a lot of women who've had similar experiences, that a common thread that comes up for women is that because we live in such a time where supporting people in grief is really not practiced very much, that we don't have a lot of practice doing it. So some people will just not say anything. And for myself, like having people reach out, even if I didn't have the capacity to respond, felt really supportive. People, sent notes and meals and, different things like that. Um, and just people continuing to remember even as time continued on, because time doesn't stop, even though I felt like my world stopped, but other people's worlds continued on. And so, each person in my life that has continued to remember, as like her birthday comes again each year, or just because we named her Hartley, I love the heart connection. And so, I'll get a photo of someone who cracked an egg that was in the shape of a heart, or, a heart
Oh,
stone, or these other little ways that I feel like she circles back to me, and that other people honor and
wow.
remember her as well, which makes me feel like I don't have to hold it in the same way.
When is her birthday?
August 31st.
Oh,
So,
little Virgo, just like me. Wow, thank you for sharing. That was a really touching story. How did you, I'm just going to say it bluntly,
yeah,
how did you have the courage to get pregnant again? I feel like I would be scared.
I was scared. I was scared the second time, and I didn't do things quite the same. Um, I I don't I can't tell you exactly how I walked through that fear, other than I just had a strong desire and strong knowing that I had other soul babies as well that were to come through. And that, and I had to come to a place of accepting that that was her soul's path, that I couldn't have, changed that. And that was just her life's journey to live out most of her life inside of me. And, and so we did, open ourselves to conceiving again and welcoming in another soul.
And how long was that after Hartley's passing?
Um, It wasn't quite a year. I want to say, see, this is the thing, because, that was 7 years ago now. So for me too, yeah, as time passes, some of those like, structured numbers, I can't remember in the same way. Um, but yeah, we conceived, it must have been around like April. So it was like August. So we went through like a winter and then April. And his 40 weeks was December 29th, is when he would be 40 weeks if he stayed in that long, which he did. But yeah. So in his pregnancy, I was definitely more anxious, more nervous that, we did decide we didn't do like formal genetic testing, but my husband and I both checked to see that we both had both of our kidneys. Um, because it is possible to go through our lives not knowing that we only have one kidney until something happens. So we just wanted to make sure
Wow.
that both of us had both of our kidneys, which would mean that it would be, that much less likely that we would have another baby that also didn't have kidneys.
Okay.
Um, but I did choose to have an ultrasound in that pregnancy to see that that baby did have their kidneys and all their parts. And yet I also by that time had met many other women who had experienced full-term losses and stillbirths that had ultrasounds at, 37, 38 weeks, where they're saying that your baby's totally fine. And that doesn't mean that you're going to give birth to a live baby or mother a baby, outside.
Yeah.
So I was grateful to know that he had all of his parts. And yet I also held the knowing that that doesn't guarantee life either.
Yeah, I feel like going through the two so far experiences of loss that you had gone through, that you wouldn't take anything for granted until perhaps you're holding your baby in your arms, perhaps even past that time.
Yeah, actually, I had a beautiful counselor that I saw after Hartley's birth and death. And, she had a baby who died in his sleep at 2 years old
Ooh,
for unknown causes. And so I also, held that story with me and knew that that was also a reality. So for me, now looking back, I can sort of accept my path as also a death keeper and also holding these stories of death, and that is part of my life's path and my life's work, and that experiencing them myself has also allowed me to serve women, who are experiencing stories that are similar.
beautiful. That's necessary. We need death keepers, just like we need birth keepers.
Mm-hmm.
So, did you approach this baby's birth any differently? Now that, say, you know that you have a baby with all of his parts, you're not
Mm-hmm.
taking for granted that
Mm-hmm.
he will be born alive, of course. Probably feel the same way. But so how
Yeah.
did you approach thinking about this birth experience?
Yeah, it was really interesting. For me, I still knew that I wanted to have a home birth. A lot of the people around me, I was working in a hospital at the time, and they just were like, you know, didn't understand my choice to do that. They would expected that I would have the baby in the hospital because in their view, that would be the safer place to give birth. But for me, I still held that, for me, the safer, better place for myself and my baby was in our own home. So I again planned a home birth again with him. Hmm.
And were was your choice of care any different since you had had a stillborn baby at home? Meaning, like, were you treated as high risk or any differently in any way by a midwife or potential birth keeper, any whoever it was that you hired to be with you?
Um, yeah, I hired a midwife, and no, other than I think they felt comforted that I chose to have an ultrasound in that pregnancy.
Mm, that
I
makes
think,
sense.
But they didn't really treat me any different other than I wanted them to know Hartley's story and know that that was my previous experience and not pretend that this was my first birth. Um,
Yeah.
and I felt held in that way, which was good. Yeah.
I'm so glad to hear that. That's great. Do you want to tell us about that birth experience?
Sure. So, yeah. I also didn't know he was a he. I actually thought he was going to be a girl. I think part of that was me just sort of yearning for a girl because Hartley was a girl. Um, so I hit my 40 weeks. I had a midwife appointment that day, and, nothing had been happening yet. And I went to sleep that night and woke up early in the wee hours of the morning with contractions. I think it was two-ish or something like that. And my husband was sleeping, and I just went out into our living area and labored for a while on my own, which I really enjoyed. And then I decided to send him a little message just in, to let him know that I was in labor because I didn't want him to wake up and stay in bed. I wanted him rested because I didn't know if it was going to be another like birth that extended over 3 days. But if he was awake, I wanted him to come out with me. And I had my little list of things that I wanted him to do, like clean the toilet in case I was going to puke and vacuum and this and that.
Oh, that's smart.
Yeah. Yeah. I started baking some bread because I love baking bread and thought it would be a fun thing to do in labor. And yeah, when I sent him the message, it turned out his ringer wasn't off, which normally it is. And so he woke up to the message and came out and was like, "Oh, so excited that I was in labor." And that was fun. And it felt like when he came out, my labor shifted. Like his presence definitely shifted the energy of the labor. And he asked if it was okay if he took a quick shower. And I was like, "Oh, yeah." Like I was like feeling in my groove. And I asked him if he wanted eggs. I made him some eggs for breakfast. Um, and then he got going on my little list. But as soon as he got out of the shower, I feel like the contractions just like took it up, a few more notches. I was recording them a little bit, but not fully. They weren't really consistent. They were like 2 minutes apart, then 6 minutes apart, but definitely increasing in strength. So I got in the shower to see if that would help and had him start to try and blow up the birth pool. But the contractions were coming super strong and like even though they were inconsistent, they were really strong. And I was like, oh my gosh. And so I decided to just fill the bath, like our normal bath, with water and see what that was like. And he asked if he should call the midwife. And I was like, oh, maybe, I don't know. And since I had been a birth attendant, like I also knew I had this like insecurity of not wanting the midwife and the people to be there for a really long time, but I wanted them to be able to be there for a short time. So I told her not to come yet. And then, a few minutes later, my water broke in the bath and I was starting to feel the like pushy feel. So he called her back and she was already sort of getting ready to come. And she walked in the door and set her stuff down and kind of, peeked at me. She didn't, touch me at all, but she could see that his head was starting to emerge at that point. And 7 minutes later, he was born and cried right away, which I was so grateful
Oh,
for. That was
yeah.
one thing when he was like in womb. I was like, please just, cry right away. Like I know that there's such a, broad range of what's normal with breathing after birth, but I really just wanted him to cry right away. And he did.
Mm, that's so sweet. What was it like holding him? What was that moment like?
I felt like I was a little bit in shock just how quickly his labor progressed compared to Hartley's labor and birth. So I feel like I went out of body a little bit in that experience, and it took me a little to come back into myself after he was born.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Hmm.
Wow. So what was your postpartum like?
I was just in bliss that I had this living baby and that he was nursing like a little champ. And um, I did experience, anxiety and sort of a secondary grief experience after birthing him, sort of reliving some of those moments with Hartley and Hartley's body after and things like that. And was, maybe a little more worried about him continuing to breathe and continuing to live after he was born in those early postpartum weeks and months.
Yeah, that makes
Yeah.
sense. Wow. So, what is next for you in your whole journey of motherhood?
Next after him or next right now?
Next after him.
So, next after him, he was almost 2, and I had been, tracking. I knew my fertile signs and was sort of loosely tracking, and yet we were also open to the possibility of conception. And as fate would have it, we unexpectedly conceived. And when I went to like look at what my, 40 weeks due date would be, it was my birthday, my exact birthday, November 20th, which just
Oh,
felt
wow.
like, what? Like that felt so amazing and aligned. I was like, oh, this little spirit in me, like there's a fly bug in me. Um, that I was also, conceived unintentionally, and then this little one was as well. And so I was pretty ecstatic about that pregnancy. And I decided to do the 10-week maternal blood test to find out if that baby was a girl or a boy. Because I also, after with Odin, we named our son Odin, and I had some sort of, what's the right word for it? I had a little grief over the fact that he was male when he was born.
Mm, mhm.
And so I felt like I wanted to know beforehand that that felt good to me at the time. But actually, before I received the results back, I started to bleed and had an early
Mm.
birth with what turned out to be a girl in that pregnancy.
Oh, I'm so sorry. That must have been so hard.
It was. Yeah. Yeah. And of course, it's so interesting. You asked of like what to say to people who have experienced loss. And I do share with some people of something not to say, which is I had, had several people tell me that it wouldn't ever happen again. And
Mm.
it's just like that's such a silly thing for people to say because just no one can know that. So I encourage people
Thank
to
you for saying
hear
that.
that.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I think you're so spot on when you say that we don't really know how to deal with people who are grieving. We don't really know how to meet people in their grief. And something I'm really, really passionate about is opening dialogue around this.
Mhm.
So I think it's so important to talk about it and for me the phrase is always like at least you have a healthy baby. Like when it comes to birth trauma, people will say that all the time. And
Mhm.
that's like another one that's just like the worst. Don't ever say that
Yeah.
because it's yeah, but we need to hear these stories and we need to be taught these things because we're not taught them otherwise.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was that next experience. And actually, I'm thinking back to the message that I wrote you, and I said 5 pregnancies, but really I had 6 pregnancies because I had another one in between my son and then my living daughter. So then I had another pregnancy that ended just at 6 weeks, so an early birth. Um, And then I felt like, my husband and I were open to conception, and yet no little soul was coming in for a while. And that just brought me to calling out to universe again and being like, is there another baby or, is this it? And, sort of trying to make peace with the unknown there as well. And But then near the summer solstice of, I guess it must have been 2019, um, we conceived another little wombling, and I was so happy, so grateful. And that pregnancy, I puked and puked and puked even worse than Hartley.
Oh.
And that actually wound up worrying some people around me, surrounding me, because they saw that as being so similar to Hartley's pregnancy that I think and I honestly had moments where I thought that might be the case too. And I chose not to have an ultrasound to see if, this baby had kidneys, even though I was vomiting and throwing up like in Hartley's pregnancy.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Wow. So, did you make the same decisions around birthing at home, birthing with a midwife
No, by
this
that,
next
so
time?
yeah, it's so interesting. Even though I had attended births for so many years with midwives, been like obsessed with birth, loved birth, like hearing all the birth stories, it wasn't until after I birthed my son that I heard the word free birth and unassisted birth, and like, did that come into my like realm of reality, which upon reflection just feels so bizarre, especially because actually my grandmother, had an unplanned unassisted birth, but like,
Wow.
obviously it's possible, and that happened for her. And even though I
Can
have
you
that,
just tell me how that happened for her? Like, did it just happen too fast? I'm
yeah,
just so
so
curious.
yeah, so actually her first two births were unplanned, unassisted, and the first was like she was on a road trip with her husband and birthed my uncle in a car and then took him to the hospital. And so
Wow.
because she'd had that experience, then when she was pregnant with my mother, they decided to like move closer to the hospital and stay with like a relative that was closer to the hospital so that they could get to the hospital sooner. And and yet, like as the story goes, like she woke up in labor, and she birthed my mother at the bottom of these wooden stairs that I got to go like gaze upon and sit at when I was a young
Oh,
child,
wow.
as my
That's
grandfather
wild.
was like putting his pants on. So, birth, birth
Wow.
happens with or without
That's cool.
people around us. Yeah.
It does. So free birth comes into your consciousness for this time around.
Yes. And I had, and reflecting upon my son's birth, I remember that like moment where like I knew that the birth was coming and that I had mentally prepared to have my midwife present. And so there was this part of me that was like holding, waiting for her to arrive before I felt like I wanted to give birth because I had envisioned her there. And so then I was
Mhm.
just like, well, what if I just envision her not there and having, my husband there, and then also my son did want to be there, so we had planned for him to be able to be there. And but because I knew that he in the moment he was, going to be 3 at that time, I knew that there was a chance that he said he wanted to be there, but in reality he might not want to be there. So I had invited my mother-in-law to come and be with us and be kind of his safe person in case he wanted to leave the birthing space. But yeah, I
That's
decided I
wonderful.
just wanted to plan to have a birth without a medical attendant there.
Wow. So tell us about that birth experience.
Yes. So her birth also started early in the morning, but for hers, it was more like 3 in the morning. And hers, there was like no gentle easing into it. It was like fierce and strong and hard. Like other two labors, I felt like I was able to find some sort of a rhythm with her. I was trying all the different positions and things, and nothing was helping. So then I, woke up my husband. I was like, you have to come out here and just at least be with me. And I wanted to see if his presence would help. I mean, it felt good, but it didn't really change the sensations that I was experiencing. And I had wanted this birth to be videotaped and photographed because I hadn't had that with my other two. And loving birth as much as I do, I wanted to be able to like witness myself in that way because experiencing it is different than like, I don't know. You know what I'm saying? Where
Yeah.
I was so in it with the other birds that I couldn't like remember really everything that happened. Kind of like you're saying, you don't really remember your placenta being born or like,
Yeah.
so I had these two beautiful women in my life, one that had attended births before and one that had never witnessed a birth, but I just knew them and they trusted me and trusted birth, and they came and were a really beautiful presence of space holding during my birth. And my daughter was born just around 6 a.m. As the sun was rising. And I remember, yeah, it was just so strong and hard. And I'd created a beautiful space in our living room. My first two babies were in water. I'd wanted to experience what it was like to have a dry birth or a birth on land, however you might want to put it. And I had like a mirror in front of me and a like circular mirror down at the bottom so that I could witness her emergence if I wanted to. But yeah, it just was hard and fast. And I remember I held her in for a while with my hand, like her head was pushing, trying to come out, and I held her there, held her in with my hand for several contractions before I then, released my hand. And in the video, I say something like, I know I just got to let her come. And, or then her head comes out and then the rest of her body. And yeah, my son was right there and super in it. Um, and then
Oh,
she was birthed like up to kind of her belly. She had the umbilical cord kind of at like a lasso or something around a sash around her neck. And with my husband's assistance, I was able to slip it over her head, and she came out and cried and was alive and well and had all of her parts.
and what was it like to have your girl?
Oh, indescribable, like so incredible. I did do the 10-week blood test for her to know that she was a girl while she was in my womb. And I definitely thought about, that she was, holding her eggs also inside of me. And so I got to hold that energetic physical piece that could possibly be my
Mm,
grandchildren someday inside of my womb as I held her. And
wow.
I am just so grateful for both my son and my daughter and to have them here with me and to get to be their mother.
Wow. Amana, thank you for sharing. What
Yeah.
a beautiful, just everything. Oh, you're incredible. I realize that, we this is your podcast technically, and you generously asked me to give a little bit of an intro of, who I am, and I'm thinking that my listeners might not know who you are. So
Mhm.
even though we're doing this out of order, you just
Yeah.
shared all of your beautiful story. I would love for you to now share a little bit about who you are, the work that you do. You mentioned you're a death keeper and a birth keeper. That's awesome. Maybe you can talk a little
Mhm.
bit more about that. Anything about yourself that sort of introduces who you are to my audience.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. So yeah, like I said, I just have always been someone who has been drawn to birth and mothering and that whole experience. And I now show up for women, and I do, well, I call it like sistership, mentorship support with women virtually or in person throughout, mostly from in the times or seasons of pregnancy, birth, and mothering. I hold space for the whole spectrum of experiences, which also includes death, miscarriage, and early birth. I have, offerings that I work with women in their grief. Some of that is conversation, some of it is more like somatic work and movement and different ways that we can experience and, move with and through grief. I also was a registered nurse for years and worked in palliative care. So, also witnessed and held space for death and dying of people of all ages. Um, and yeah, I have this podcast, and Um, yeah, I can't think of what else to say now. So yeah. And I'm realizing we didn't talk about time. When do we need to stop for you?
I can stay for the 2 hours,
Okay.
the full 2 hours. I'm not quite sure where we are in
We're
terms
at
of time
like
though.
1.5 hours now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, do you feel like is there anything else we want to talk about?
I feel like it would be sort of neat to be able to try and have some dialogue around our paths, like maybe into and then sort of out of our work within the medical system.
Yeah, I think that, yeah. I know for one, I'm very curious about yours.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, I guess I can start if you want.
Sure.
I got into working within the health insurance industry. I won't say what company I worked for, but it's the biggest one. So like if you've ever had health insurance, like I work for that company.
Uh-huh.
And I got into it sort of because it was my dad my dad sort of worked tangentially with those organizations and consulting work that he did.
Mm-hmm.
So it was kind of a family business. And I got a job out of college within that industry and just sort of stuck with it for a long time because healthcare jobs are really well paying. They can be, I don't know. I mean, certainly in the field that I was in, they can be really well paying and kind of cushy, work from home sometimes, that type of thing. So it was appealing in a lot of ways. And the role that I was in, I got to touch a lot of different parts of the company. So I worked with medical management, I worked with claims. So I like looked at a lot of patient data. I worked with I worked with pharmaceutical industries that work directly with us as the insurer. I worked with provider relations people, so that people that work on the contracts with, hospitals and medical providers. And I even worked with underwriting. So underwriting is where you look at a pool of people, you look at their ages and their gender and like what medical conditions they may have, and then you decide what we're going to charge this group of people. And I can tell you that I saw just a lot of very messed up things. And I don't know how much detail it is relevant to talk about. I will share one little anecdote that really convinced me that the system is totally broken the way that it's functioning. And that's not to say there's not great people. There's not people that really care about patient care and really want to support true health. There's good people within bad systems. And it's my belief that what I saw was just a really, really bad system. So I can remember this one time I was sitting in an underwriting meeting and the underwriters were looking at one company. It was like a small company, like a mom and pop company. They had maybe 20 employees. And there was a man in this company that had a pretty scary cancer diagnosis. And they were looking at his claims data. And all of the underwriters said, well, this is going to be way too expensive. We have to hike up their rates and get them out of the pool. And so the monthly rates for this company, the rates to pay insurance for their employees went up so high that they had to cancel it. And the absolute just disregard for human life and human suffering, it was so ugly to witness. And no one in the room even really, I was kind of looking around like, did I just see what I thought I just saw? And no one in the room it didn't even seem to register.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, that's just one example of some of the stuff I saw.
Mm-hmm.
And I will say, like, now, I've been out of that industry since my son was born, so about 9 years. And wow, I know so much more about how completely corrupt pharmaceutical companies are. Um, I now look at the whole model of the body in a completely different way than I did then. Like I actually think that the way that we think about health and what healthcare actually is not actually healthcare. I think healthcare is something completely different. And my views would be considered probably super extreme by a lot of people at this point. But even then, all throughout my 20s and early 30s, I I just had the feeling that something about this feels wrong, and it really took having that first actual experience in the hospital, giving birth, experiencing firsthand what it's like to be dealing with, because that was really the first time I had ever had an encounter with the healthcare system. And it really was that experience that finally prompted me to quit. And I was the breadwinner at the time. So my partner was working, but I was making the majority of the money, and we didn't really know how that was going to work out. And thank God, it did, as I think it usually does when you make the right decision. Even if it's scary, usually doors open that you didn't see,
Mhm.
and blessings come that maybe you weren't expecting. And that definitely happened in our case. So that's kind of my history and how I got out.
And did you grow up in a family that was very medical? Like, was it common for your mom or whoever to take you to the doctor growing up? Was that, were they idealized or, yeah, feared, or how was that in your family?
It's oh wow, it's actually kind of hard for me to answer your question, because at the time, when I like putting myself back into my own childhood, my mom would have been considered kind of a hippie. Sort of, she understood like what organic food was important, which, in the late 80s, I don't think a lot of people were talking about that.
Mm-mm.
But she definitely still felt, I mean, she still took us to pediatricians, which I feel is hugely useless. Like, I don't even know why people do it, but okay. And so to me now, as the adult, like I think of it very differently. But my dad, my whole childhood, had a pretty severe autoimmune condition that was highly medically supervised and highly medicated. By the way, none of it ever made him better or improved his health in any way. In
Mm-hmm.
fact, I would argue that years and years and years being treated for his specific condition only deteriorated him over the long term, which I'm sad to say that out loud, but I feel like it's true. And I also feel like it's almost as if watching my dad's interaction with allopathic care shaped my current views even more than my experience within the system.
Mm-hmm.
So I answered your question sort of unclearly, but I guess we're sort of a little bit in between.
Mm-hmm.
But like from my perspective now, way too medical from my perspective now, but that's just who I am today. So
Sure. Yeah, and I mean, I agree with you that there are so many like caring people within the medical system that, want to and feel like they are, giving healing care. And, I do believe that there are some instances where industrialized medicine does help people. And yet, like you said, there was like this disconnect almost when you spoke about that one story of this man who had cancer and that then they had to like increase the price and then totally drop the coverage, that it's almost like they can't see it because it would force things to change.
well, and it would shatter the cognitive dissonance. I think there's a lot of
Yeah.
cognitive dissonance on the side both of healthcare providers and many, many people involved in the whole healthcare machine. And I'm of course speaking of the
Mhm.
United States where we
Sure.
live. It might be
Yeah, me
different in other
too.
countries. That's just
Hmm.
what I saw. A lot of cognitive dissonance.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would say that's even the case with people choosing to seek medical care and engage in the patient role, that also oftentimes, I mean, I did it myself. I grew up in a family that was very medicalized, and, like you go to the doctor and you do what they say, and antibiotics and, all the things. Um, but totally like looked off and lost my train of thought there. Um,
Well, can I ask you about that then?
yeah,
And maybe we
yeah.
could lead a little bit into your story, because I'm curious. I don't want to make an assumption about you, but just from our time speaking, it feels to me like you are not a very super medically minded person. I mean, having had your babies at home, having free birth to baby too,
Mm-hmm.
seems like you utilize the system when it makes sense for you and you decide that you feel like it's something that you need. But um, growing up with that mindset, did something shift for you, or how can you
Yes.
talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. I feel like it happened over a period of years. I feel like a lot of it happened sort of in my late 20s, early 30s. I did like live abroad in France for a year, and there it's, things are medicalized too, but just the way of living is a little bit different and just experiencing a different culture and different way of doing things. I first got a degree in sociology and really enjoyed the studying of people and cultures and the way people do things differently. But I am like a recovering good girl, and I feel like in my family, being a good girl also meant like going to the doctor and getting your yearly pap smear and like these sorts of things that now I choose not to do. But at the time, I thought I was like a bad person or a bad girl if I didn't do those things. And in my family, I am sort of, outside of what my parents and my siblings and how they participate in the medical system is very different than the way I do at this point. I was always a caring, nurturing person. I love taking care of babies and kids and whatnot. And so I decided to go into the field of nursing actually after that was in my early 20s after my first love died of cancer. He was saying that, he felt like I would be a good nurse, and I wasn't sure where my path was after I got my degree in sociology. There's not really, a direct path into the workforce from that. And so I did go into nursing. I knew I didn't want it. My dad kept being like, "Why don't you just be a doctor?" And I was like, "I don't want to be a doctor." I knew that the doctor role was different and less person focused, and I knew I wanted to like care and be with people, not just like be in and out of the room in a few minutes. So I decided,
So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
no, it's all good.
Did you did you choose palliative care right away, or did you find yourself, how did you find yourself in that role specifically?
Yeah, I didn't. So I started um, in a smaller hospital on the medical oncology floor. And it was, in my, like the narrative that I had been told was that, hospitals and medicine and doctors help and heal people. And they have, and even in the different hospitals that I've worked for, all of them like say that their model is patient-centered care and the patient's at the top. And then as I got into the role, I realized that that's ridiculous and that's not true. And it's not patient-centered at all. It is money centered and also focused on like the people working and making their workflow better. And it's not about
Yeah.
healing people, because if it were about like, we know now that, soda and juice and like jello with food coloring in it, like are evidentially not good for us. And yet that is what we serve people in the hospital that are healing, that we're trying to heal them with like these foods that are not full of nourishment. And we're
One
waking them.
might even call them cancer causing.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And we're waking them up at 5 in the morning to prick their finger or to draw blood because that's when it's convenient, because the doctor comes in at this time and that's when the results will be back. And just seeing how, like, also when I participated as a patient within the system, that I also like felt the like good girl persona again, when they ask you to put on the robe or the wristband or, these different things. And then learning from the inside out that, some of those things are required, but like also you don't have to wear the hospital gown if you don't want to. And so as I gained more experience in different floors and then in different hospitals, I just realized that it wasn't a place of healing. It wasn't patient centered. It wasn't person centered. And that and that's sort of when I looked for palliative care, which is more whole person care. It's a newer what's it called? Not division, but
Specialty?
specialty. It's a newer specialty of medicine that is trying to like bring in this like mind, body, spirit type of care, but it's not enough. And it's only with people with life limiting conditions, not like every human, just as they're going through their life, that we're looking at them as a whole person and not just like a number. Because literally in a hospital, you're a medical record number. You're not a name. You're not a human. And we don't treat people that way within the system. So, but
Yeah.
I was drawn to palliative care, and I did that for 5 years. And that felt more aligned with me. Like I'm a Reiki master, and I was able to do Reiki for these people in the hospital, being paid to do Reiki in a Catholic hospital, which, at the
Wow.
time I was, slowly unraveling my own, stories around the medical model. And, parts of me felt like that was enough in the moment. And then over time, it became not enough. And I knew that I no longer wanted to be a part of, like you said, this broken, corrupt system. That not about because there are really beautiful, good people working within the system. And yet I no longer wanted to be there. Did that answer your
Yeah.
question?
Yeah, it does answer my question. I'll just say, I remember vividly being with my grandma when she was in a palliative care place right before she died. And I felt a sense of holiness there that was so different from when I had been visiting her in the hospital. Like the entire vibe was completely different.
Mm-hmm.
And the respect and I guess it was the respect that I felt from the nurses and the healthcare providers that were working in her palliative care facility really impressed me. It was a very interesting experience. And I actually had the privilege of being with her the moment she passed. She was breathing one moment and then she stopped. And it was just me and my mom with her.
Mm-hmm.
And we let the nurse know. And the first thing that the nurse did is she came in and she lit a couple candles for my grandma. And that's the first thing that she did. She honored her life. And it was it was honestly so beautiful to witness. And it makes perfect sense to me just getting like that you would move to that specialty because there is something in it that I've just seen as more honoring of life. It's almost like if we can't wring any more dollars, not to be hugely cynical, I realize how cynical that sounds, but when you're at the end of your life, you can't really prescribe more stuff, And so maybe that's where there's more space for humanity, for our own humanity to come out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I'm so glad you got that experience with your grandmother. Um, Witnessing death. I've witnessed many deaths now in the hospital and a few outside of the hospital. And I just, that first and last breath, like to witness and be present for those. It's just the energies are similar and different, both like very
Yep.
palpable, the feeling of
Yes.
the soul as the body takes their first breath, and also as, that last breath happens and the soul leaves the body. And
Yeah.
I've just really come to honor and, want to hold space for and talk about both, because just like, night and day, you can't have one without the other. And right now we're living in such a time where most people don't really think about death and don't want to think about it, don't want to talk about it, um, try to pretend like it, isn't going to happen. And some people, choose to go into the medical model to choose, what more. I mean, it's called practicing medicine for a reason. Like, what other things can you practice or try out on me to maybe make me die later than I would, or something, if you know what I mean by that. Um,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
rather than like honoring the natural physiological process of death. Just like I really want to honor the natural physiological process of birth, that most people aren't having physiological deaths right now. Most people are also having medicalized deaths.
Mm-hmm. I've heard more than one wise woman make the connection between highly medicalized births, highly medicalized deaths, and how in our culture we're doing both of those things, and both of those things are in some ways very deeply connected.
Absolutely. Yes.
I love that you were essentially a death keeper within the system, and now you're a death keeper outside of the system. I feel like part of what we need moving into like whatever is next for humanity, which I'm praying and hoping is some manner of awakening and a better world and a new paradigm. A huge part of that is all of us leaving the systems that no longer work and
Mm.
creating something new and better. And I definitely see that in you. And I just want to honor you and thank you for being part of what I think is really, really, really necessary and needed.
Mm. Thank you. Thank you. Like I said, I love your podcast, and the work that you're doing in the world is so important for women to be able to receive that story medicine, and just the way that you hold space and listen to people's stories is just incredibly honoring of those stories. And I'm so grateful that you're doing that. This feels like maybe a natural place to close. Before we close, I'd love for you to tell everyone where they can find you, your website or Instagram, podcast, all the places.
Yeah, thank you. My website is healingbirth.net, and that's where you can get in touch with me. You can email me. You can listen to the podcast on the website if you want. Our Instagram is the same. It's just at Healing Birth. And Healing Birth, the podcast, is available on all streaming platforms. Any place that you listen to podcasts, you can search for Healing Birth and listen to the show. And I would like to invite you to do the same for my listeners. Where can people find you, work with you, your website, listen to your podcast?
Yeah, so my podcast is The Heart of the Soul, and my website is www.birthingnova.love. And there you can, yeah, see what other podcasts I've been on and work with me one-on-one in multiple different ways. So, yeah. Um, yeah, so I'm just going to do my little closed spiel here, and then I'll stop recording. Thank you to all of you for tuning in today. If you love the podcast, I would be so grateful if you choose to subscribe, rate, review, or share the show. If you feel aligned with me and feel called to dive deeper together, move through grief, a traumatic birth experience, prepare for a home or free birth, I offer virtual and in-person sistership support to women locally and virtually all over the world. To learn more, you can book your free clarity call at birthingnova.love. And I'm also a practicing medium and offer spiritual readings through my website as well. I'd love to connect with you. And until next time, remember to be brave, be bold, be love, and be you.